What is up, everyone? This type of image sequence header, this scroll controlled header, just looks super cool. In this video, I'm going to be talking through the code, breaking it down step by step, and this is the end result. As you can see, it's super smooth. It's looks like the AirPods Pro header, which is loosely what it's been based on. When you can learn to implement these types of headers, it can really take your web experiences to the next level. Shout out to Derek Elliott, who masterfully crafted the assets here, these custom pragmatic wine bottles. You can download these from the link in description if you want to code along, or if you're the type of person who wants to kind of just dive straight into the code, there will be a link to the GitHub repo in the video description. If you benefit from me sharing the code or talking through it, please give this a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. In the next video, we'll be adding a cool kind of dynamic background shader to the page. All right, buckle up because this one has a few moving parts. Let's get into the code. In the home page, I've created this image sequence header component, which is a TypeScript function component. And let's run through the process then. Firstly, we're going to need to prepare the image sequence frames. These will be typically exported from a 3D design tool such as Blender. And big thank you to Derek, who has kindly rendered and exported the image sequence used in this project. As you'll see here, I've got 60 frames, and these, if we move through them, basically just the different images from the 3D animation. Once you've got those, and you can download these from the link in the description, then we can move on to loading the images and drawing the first frame into the canvas. After that, we can create a scroll trigger that will update the image being displayed as the user scrolls down. We'll look at animating it in and adding text transitions. We will then handle the viewport resize, which is important just for good responsive design practice. All right, we'll start by just checking out the markup. So to begin with, I've just got a canvas element with a ref on it, and this is inside a fixed container. We will change that as we move through the process. Then I have a use effect, which is firstly returning out if the canvas ref hasn't been assigned. It is also returning out if the viewport width or height are 0. I'm getting the viewport size from the use mantine, or at mantine hooks, use viewport size. And then finally, it's also returning out if the loaded images exist. And this is just so that basically this function will only run once, because once it's called the initial setup and it's loaded the images, it's set the images into state, and then this function won't be called again. The viewport width and height are used to set the size of the canvas. This just ensures that it's full size. The image width and height are slightly different because they have an underlying aspect ratio. And so we want it to be the full width, but then we're going to adjust the height of the image based on the aspect ratio of it. So if the viewport width was 1000, we would then do 1000 times whatever its aspect ratio is to give, say, 700 pixels or something. If we check the code, so yeah, it's basically just loading the image. If we check the network tab, we'll see here that it's gone through and loaded all of those. The canvas context is gotten at this point with alpha specified as true so that we can have the transparency, because what we want is this canvas on top of the heading and subheading below. I'm generating an array of image sources. We know how many frames there are as we've got these in the folder. We also know the file name structure, and so with that we can loop through, use the index, a little bit of handling if it's less than 10 because it needs that additional 0 put in front of it, or it's just I plus 1 because these will start at 1, whereas the array index will start at 0, obviously. So yeah, that will give us 60 image sources. And then we'll pass these image sources into a function to load the images and draw the first frame, along with the canvas and the canvas context, which are needed to actually draw. So, I mean, in fact, this could potentially be moved inside to this function and get the canvas context in here. What we have in here is a promise which handles loading all of the images. The images are defined in an array, and we keep track of the loaded count. And then at the bottom here, we've got a for loop, which will create HTML image. It will assign the source from the image sources. So this will be the first one. The image width and height are scaled based off of the canvas width. So this width passed in here is actually the width of the image. Yeah, the image width and the image height. So maybe I'll rename that. And I'll log these values as well. Add the event listener to load, and on load we will draw the first canvas frame if it's index 0. And this is where we need the canvas context and the canvas itself. So we're getting the width and height from the canvas, clearing it and then just drawing into the context here. We need to clear it each time, otherwise it will function additively and layer all the images on top of each other, which we don't want. So we'll load each of the images in a loop and increment the loaded count, and then once we've loaded them all, we can resolve this promise, this outer promise here, which will resolve with the images. If there's an image error, then set this up to retry 3 times. And this here is basically mutating the image source in a way that won't affect what's been loaded, but will trigger a new download of it. So yeah, I hope you're with me. Basically, we're getting loading all the images, returning them when every single one of them's downloaded, passing the canvas in to update the canvas image, drawing an image onto it. The offset here is relevant if the image size and canvas size don't match up, which would happen if, say, you had a square image that you're putting into a full width canvas. You'd want it to be centered in the middle. Likewise, if the image is larger on the y-axis or x-axis, then you need to offset it. Otherwise, it's going to be heading off to the right or the bottom. So we've got the initial setup, we've got the loaded images, and we're setting the loaded images into the state. Just clear that. So yeah, 59 frames, 59 images loaded. Now the next part is to actually create a scroll trigger. So I'm using GSAP plugin here, which is the scroll trigger plugin, and you need to make sure that you register this if you're planning to use it. The scroll trigger can work in two ways. You can either create a trigger like this, or you can attach a trigger to an animation. But in this case, we're not really animating anything. We just want to get the progress, and this onUpdate is a handy function for reading that. So if I put a login here, what it's set up to do at the moment is to start at 0 and end at 1000 pixels scroll. Scrub means that it will update the progress as you move up and down. So we can log that. You see the progress value over here. We'll keep going up to 1 until we reach 1000 pixels, and then it will be progress 1. The progress will then be used to determine the next frame. So if I log the next frame, all the way down, and then that value can index the array, access the value from the array, which we've got. So we've got our loaded images here. The use GSAP function is similar to a use effect, except it's good practice if you're using GSAP functions and tools to use a use GSAP hook instead of a use effect. We'll see down here that we can specify dependencies just as you can with a use effect, and you can also specify scope, which is used to determine query selection kind of scope limitations. The scroll trigger, therefore, is set up currently to just move 0 to 1000, and then we'll update the canvas image using the canvas context and the canvas ref. Oddly, that's throwing an error, even though up here we're saying it has to exist, but okay. Yeah, so render the image, draw the image into the canvas again. And so now we have our scroll controlled animation sequence, image sequence, and it's looking good already. Check that. Now I'm going to change the markup back to the more complete setup, and what we have here is the header with a header ref, a height, currently 300 large view height, and the content wrapper inside of it will contain our heading and our canvas. I'll leave the heading out for now, the headings, they're both there, but keep the canvas in here. And what I'm going to do is now show you what happens. So as you'd expect, this is scrolling off with the header. We don't want that to happen. We really want it to be fixed until we get to a certain point and then unfix it. And that's why we have the content wrapper here, because with this content wrapper, we can pin the content using a different scroll trigger. So this scroll trigger will use the header, and it will say at the top or at 0 is when I'll start, and I'll end when the bottom of the header hits the top of the viewport, so the top of the screen. And throughout this, I want to make sure that I pin the content wrapper. So now, as we scroll down, this isn't moving off the screen, and it will do once that's done. So we can check the styling on it here. See that this is fixed. Now we'll go scroll 300 view height, and now it's no longer fixed, and it will be moving off the screen. So I can put a border green or whatever on this, and then also a border on the content wrapper. What colors we got? Cyan will do. Yeah, so now at that point it will unpin. Also notice that the movement of the image sequence is now not set up correctly to the movement of the header. So I need to update the scroll trigger and define what the trigger element is, and then change when it ends. And we want it to end in the same point at which the pinning ends. So now we'll have a slower scroll until that header leaves there, and then we're done and it can unpin it. I put in some padding here. I'm going to put in a padding element. I'm going to just remove that and then flip back. So we get to some next page content basically as we scroll down. Might be better if I made this section more visible. So that's coming in there. Just because I've put some spacing in here which we don't necessarily need. Yeah, I think the issue here is that this is coming up over the top of that, so we need to either put some spacing in there or ensure that the Z index of this is higher. I don't know if I can just put a Z index on here to sort that out. Yeah. So now we'll see, we come down and that's entering the next section. So yeah, recapping, scroll trigger, which is using the header, but it doesn't have to use the header. It could have a fixed start and end pixel value. The header has a height of 300 view height, and so adjusting this determines how quick the scrolling happens. So if I half that value, now it's 150 view height, so I'll just be scrolling much less, and that actually kind of works pretty nicely, to be fair. So I think I'll leave it on 200, which is less than what it was. Now I'm going to want to animate this in. The GSAP timeline is called within the use GSAP hook, and it's only being called again if we have images. So we're not going to want to bring the canvas in till it's ready. I'm going to start the canvas on 0 opacity. We are using the set function, and well, if you're not familiar with the timeline, it's a way in which you can sequence tweens or GSAP functions such as set together, and it's really powerful. You can fine tune when things start. You've obviously got all the easing capabilities. It's really good, worth learning if you're doing web animation, but I'm sure you've heard of it. The canvas is just set to 0.7. I mean, in fact, we could just get rid of that and handle it on the Tailwind CSS. So we've got that initially scaled to 0.75. And then what we're going to do after a short delay, we're going to bring its opacity to 1, and we're then going to bring its scale to 1. And the reason this is so that it appears and then fades in, just gives it that kind of nice, hey, I'm here. And we'll time the text, the heading, to come in with that. Okay, so that's looking good. I think it's time to add in the heading and the heading too. So what I've got here is a wrapper for the H1 and the Derek.com link. If you're going simpler, you just have the H1, you wouldn't need this wrapping div. It's really just a container for those two pieces of text. So now you can see we've got master your craft and animate responsibly. We want both of those to start hidden. So I'm going to put the opacity onto that heading, and I'm going to put the opacity 0 onto this heading. So now you can't see the heading 2. The heading 1 is animating in nicely because we've got here this from 2, which is saying set my scale. Now again, I might consider putting the scale on the CSS. That's an option, but either way, we're defining that it's hidden and scaled down, and then that it comes in with an ease for 0.7 seconds. And here we're basically saying I want to start this animation 0.7 seconds before this one finishes. If I take this off, it will just happen after the first one. So I go from this one, then that one. If I say start me at the same time, I can say that, and that will basically say at the same time as the canvas. But the canvas is taking 0.9 seconds, whereas this one's a little bit quicker. And so because of that, we're saying actually start me so that we both finish at the same time. So now that even though the text moves quicker, they both finish at the same time. Kind of gives it a nice like slight stagger to it. And this has been copied, stolen from the AirPods Pro header. So if I get that one up, you'll see what I mean here. I've done another video on actually just recreating that with this groundbreaking sound coming in and the video fading in afterwards. So I've recreated this in another video. Code isn't available though because it's using their assets. So yeah, that looks good. We've got the scroll trigger set up. The next thing we want to do is animate the text on scroll. And the timeline has an onComplete function. So what we can say is when you've done all of these, then do something else. And in this case, I'm actually just stringing another timeline together. The reason that this isn't part of the same timeline is that this timeline plays immediately. This timeline for the text has a scroll trigger attached to it. So as I said earlier, you can put a scroll trigger onto an animation. You can put it onto an entire timeline or directly onto like a single GSAP.2 method. Again, we've got the header as our trigger. We're starting at 0 and we're ending at the bottom when the header leaves the viewport. And we're scrubbing the timeline value, or the progress value. We're also setting the easing to none so that we don't have, well, basically so that we have a nice linear progress through this timeline rather than it starting or ending slowly. All right, I need to grab a drink. 1 sec. The timeline is targeting our heading, which is actually our div that wraps the H1 and the Derek link. And it is scaling it, and then it's scaling it further while setting its opacity. And we'll see the effect that this has now that it's in place. Oh, it will have no effect. Let me save this and rerun it. Yeah, so we're scaling, and then we're fading, and then we're fading in the next bit. I am going to put a bit of spacing in here just so that we're not hitting that light grey section. Yep. Handling the heading, and then we're doing the H2, and the H2 is scaling in to full opacity, then it continues to scale to full scale and then fades back out. And this is so that we get this kind of in-out effect, but it continues to move whilst the opacity is changing. And again, this is basically borrowed from the way in which the Apple website set up their hero header. Keyframes are really powerful here. You can do whatever you want, really. Useful if you are targeting the same element. And instead of writing 2H2 scale, 2H2 scale on separate functions, you can kind of put them in here. And you can also then assign durations to them so that this bit will be happening over 2/3 of the entire animation. This will happen over 1/3. Yeah, it's worth noting actually that the durations here, because this is controlled by a scroll trigger, the durations don't actually equate to seconds, they equate to sort of a percentage of the entire timeline. So if this is 0.6 and this is 0.3, we're basically saying that the entire timeline takes 0.9, well, plus this here. This is a gap. This is a 0.05 second gap between these. So the entire timeline is 0.95, which means this takes up about 60% of it, and this takes up, or 65%, and this takes up the other 35%. Yeah, and so by making this higher, so if I make this say 2 seconds, what we'll see is it will still complete the timeline, but the text will move slowly firstly, and then that second section is just going to happen really quickly. And so this just involves a little bit of fiddling around. Like if I make it slightly slower, and then there'll be more emphasis on the second heading, whereas that first one fades out quicker, and that comes in. That works quite nicely. Happy with that. So the use GSAP function is creating a trigger for the image sequence frames, a trigger to pin the content so it doesn't scroll off the screen, then the animation in and the animations for the header text for headings. Now at this point we have a pretty decent working solution. We need to handle the resize now. So the initial setup will only be called once. Well, it will be called once, because once it's run, the images are set into state, and then that use effect won't run again because of the returns at the top. The use GSAP will only be called when the images are loaded. Well, it'll be called it'll be run. The logic will be run once the images have loaded. So again, we only want to create these triggers once, really. We only want to animate it in once, so that's all fine. But what we do need to do is handle the viewport size change. Now, we can just use the viewport size value, but obviously as a browser window's size is changing, because as users resizing, that value is going to be changing a lot. So I've opted to use this use debounced value, which is another Mantine hook. And basically I'm just passing the viewport size into that and saying debounce it for 500 milliseconds. And we'll get out the debounced viewport size. Now, if we log those two values, viewport size and deport viewport size, what we'll see is that the viewport size has changed. So, let's find one up here. Sorry, the viewport size has changed, but the debounced viewport size hasn't changed throughout these. 1882, 1334. And finally, the last one will be where the debounced viewport size has caught up to match it. If I resize it now, I mean, it is centering the canvas. It's not awful. but the size of the canvas is still incorrect because we're resizing this to say this is now at 1200, but the canvas itself is at 1330, which was where it started. This is where the use did update hook can be helpful. We don't want to run this on the initial value. We are just going to check that there is a debounced size, width, and height, and that the images have loaded, that there's a canvas, and then finally that the canvas width doesn't equal the debounced viewport size width, which it will do on the first render because the first update, the use debounced value will set itself to the viewport size, and so this would then run, but we're just checking that the canvas isn't already at that size, and if it's not, we're just going to update the canvas's size. Then we're going to, if I comment out this code, oh shit, sorry, we'll just update its width and height. You see now the image actually disappears until you scroll. So the canvas is now sized with 1097, and we're at 1097. So the canvas is changing its size, but it's losing its context, or the image. So yeah, we just want to basically redraw the current frame. And we can actually get the scroll trigger by ID. Because the scroll trigger has the image sequence ID on it, we can access that and read its progress value. And then we can just do the same thing to get the next image as what we're doing in here. So this, yeah, this could be extracted into some sort of other little util function. It's duplicated here. And then we're just drawing that in. So now when it resizes, as soon as the debounce comes in after 500 milliseconds, it will resize the canvas like that. And the image is at the correct point. So let's see what happens if we do that. Yeah, so we're maintaining our current frame as well. And the scroll trigger will have its own internal logic for handling the resize. But yeah, it's more evident here. If you get to this point, as you come out, that's been cropped from the canvas there, and then it's filling it again. All right, so let's check I haven't skipped over anything. Loaded the images, set them into state, which will then notify or trigger our use GSAP hook, which can then animate them in and set up the scroll triggers, the image sequence scroll trigger to set the next frame, or the current frame, and the pinning scroll trigger to fix the content wrapper until the header has finished scrolling, so that we don't scroll our content or scroll our image sequence off. Animating it in using a timeline, and we fiddle around with these values till we got something that looks good. And likewise with the text heading timeline, basically just done the same, except this one has a scroll trigger that aligns to the scroll position of the header moving up. The resize is done using a debounced value, just so that it doesn't try to set the canvas image and do all of this work every single frame as the window's been resized. That is it, I think, my friends. The code will go into the link description. And I'll push the site live so you can actually see it and should be able to have a play with it on your own device. If you've got any feedback, let me know. I certainly do not think this is perfect. There's always room for improvement. It would be good to say load the images up front rather than starting to load them client side. So perhaps someone can shed some advice on that. If you've made it this far, please like and consider subscribing to help my channel. And I've got lots of cool videos coming up. Some will be using React 3 Fiber, some custom shader work, so we can create a really nice background for this website. And that's that. Have a nice day and happy coding. Peace.